Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking an absolutely monumental, world-changing geopolitical race. We are going to look at how a desperate search for new trade routes, fueled by cutthroat competition and rapid technological innovation, quite literally changed the entire course of human history. Okay, let's dive into this. What could possibly drive Europeans to cross a vast, terrifying, and completely unmapped Atlantic Ocean? Think about the sheer courage, or honestly, the absolute desperation required to just leap into the void like that. Was it all about gold? Was it religion? Or maybe just that fundamental human urge to explore? Well, the real answer actually starts long before Columbus ever set sail. Section 1, the Asian Trade Crisis. So picture this, it's the 1400s. Europe is finally stabilizing after centuries of just utter chaos. And with that stability comes a massive, insatiable appetite for luxury goods. We're talking about highly prized Asian spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, along with silk, porcelain, and precious gems. But here's the problem. European merchants were just bleeding money because rival empires and strict monopolies, particularly the Venetian and Arab traders, controlled all the overland routes. Europeans were being forced to pay sky-high taxes to middlemen just to get their hands on a tiny pouch of peppercorns. Then, the breaking point arrives in 1453, when the Ottoman Empire captures Constantinople. European access to Eastern trade was practically choked off overnight. The old routes didn't just get more expensive, they became incredibly dangerous and uncertain. Europe's most powerful monarchs suddenly realized they were staring down a massive economic crisis, and they desperately needed a brand new, uninterrupted route to Asia. Section 2. Portugal's Maritime Innovation. Now, Portugal was the very first to step up to this challenge. They figured, hey, if we can't go through the Middle East, we're going to try to sail completely around Africa. But you can't just sail into the unknown with outdated tech, right? Enter Prince Henry the Navigator. He acted almost like the director of a 15th century space race. He heavily funded the development of caravels, which were these amazing, lighter, faster ships uniquely capable of sailing against the wind. And he paired them with cutting-edge tools, like the magnetic compass and the astrolabe. It was a massive technological leap that completely pushed the boundaries of global exploration. And you know what? This technological gamble paid off incredibly fast. Decades of Portuguese innovation culminated in 1488, when Bartolomeu Dias successfully rounded the southern tip of Africa, proving once and for all that the Indian Ocean could actually be reached by sea. Just a decade later, Vasco da Gama did the unthinkable. He actually reached India. Portugal had totally solved the trade crisis, securing immense wealth for themselves and leaving all their European rivals scrambling to find an alternative. Section 3. Spain's Western Gamble. So while Portugal has basically mastered the route around Africa, Spain is looking for a different path. And they ultimately decide to fund an incredibly risky, high-stakes gamble. Christopher Columbus pitches this theory. He says he can reach Asia by simply sailing west across the Atlantic. Now, let's clear something up. Educated people in the 15th century already knew the Earth was round. The idea that everyone thought it was flat is a total myth. Columbus's critical, almost fatal error was his math. He vastly, heavily underestimated the Earth's true, massive size before he managed to get funding from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Fast forward to August 1492, and Columbus departs with a 3-ship fleet, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After weeks of absolutely terrifying conditions at sea, his crew finally spotted land on October 12th in the Caribbean. But completely blinded by his own flawed math, Columbus was entirely convinced he had hit Asia, which is exactly why he mistakenly called the local indigenous people Indians. He actually went to his grave, never realizing he had stumbled upon a landmass entirely unknown to Europe, inadvertently kicking down the door to centuries of global conquest. Section 4. The Race for Empire. Once word of Columbus's discoveries got back, it sent absolute shock waves across Europe. It sparked a chaotic global land grab frenzy, as England, France, and the Netherlands all rushed in to join Spain and Portugal. So why keep pushing further into the unknown? Well, 4 core motivations drove this entire era. First, wealth, fueled by these wild, tantalizing tales of gold and silver. Second, religion, driven by a really fervent desire to spread Christianity. Third, national competition, as these rival kingdoms literally fought for global dominance. And finally, curiosity, the deep intellectual drive inspired by the Renaissance. It was this cutthroat blend of a ruthless economic mission and a daring scientific adventure. Section 5. The Columbian Exchange. Almost overnight, The world was stitched together, but the consequences of that connection were incredibly complex. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast of this era. On one side, Europe gained calorie-dense crops like maize, potatoes, and cacao, alongside just immense, unimaginable wealth. On the other side, the Americas received horses, cattle, wheat, and, tragically, devastating diseases. But this Columbian exchange wasn't just biological. It completely rewired the historical English language forever. When English speakers encountered these brand new items, they literally didn't have words for them, so they had to borrow native words. That means everyday English vocabulary you use right now, words like potato, tomato, chocolate, and canoe, are direct linguistic artifacts of this exact exchange. Millions. We really need to pause on that number for a second. That is the number of native people who died within mere decades of European arrival. Indigenous populations had absolutely no built-in immunity to European diseases like smallpox. The human cost of this is almost impossible to truly comprehend. Entire, deeply complex civilizations faced devastating conquest, violent displacement, and aggressive cultural destruction. So while European empires grew wealthier and more powerful than anything the world had ever seen, we cannot forget that it came at the cost of millions of indigenous lives in the Americas. It is a very stark, very heavy reality of this era that permanently reshaped global history. So, what does this all mean for us today? What began as a desperate search to dodge some trade taxes turned into one of the most transformative periods in all of human history. Look around you right now. The ingredients sitting in your kitchen for dinner tonight, the heavily interconnected global economy we all rely on, and even the historical English vocabulary we use to describe our everyday world, it is all echoing this 500-year-old collision. The next time you say a word like chocolate or hurricane, ask yourself, how much of our modern everyday world was actually built on the legacy of those ships sailing into the unknown? Thank you so much for joining me to explore this history today. Never stop asking questions, and I will see you in the next
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely unprecedented era of history. We are unpacking how just a few ships and a vanguard of maybe a few hundred men managed to spark a chain reaction that completely toppled massive empires and literally rewired global trade, politics, and culture forever.
I mean, just think about this for a second. What truly happens when a handful of expeditions unlocks unimaginable wealth for a single empire? Well, we're going to see exactly what happens. We're looking at the staggering momentum of the 16th century, exploring how Spain's actions, right after Columbus, sent shockwaves through the entire known world. It's a wild ride of exploration, conquest, and some incredibly profound consequences.
Okay, let's jump right into part one, Spain's expanding empire, the launchpad for conquest.
Right, so our story kicks off in the Caribbean, pretty shortly after Christopher Columbus's first voyages. Spain moved with just breathtaking speed to claim lands out there. But places like Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, they weren't just isolated little outposts. Not at all. They were highly strategic, bustling launch pads. They were the essential springboards for literally every subsequent expedition pushing deeper into the uncharted American mainland.
And you really have to wonder about the guys making these trips, right? The men crossing the ocean were driven by this deeply alluring royal pact. The Spanish crown basically said, hey, conquer new territories for us, give us absolute loyalty, and you get a cut of the spoils. So these young men left Europe absolutely dreaming of gold, fame, and noble titles. They were totally convinced that boundless riches were just sitting right there, just beyond the horizon.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Cortés and the Aztecs and the fall of Tenochtitlan.
So by 1519, the empire's focus really shifts west. We're following Hernán Cortés as his fleet sails from Cuba to the coast of present-day Mexico. And you have to wrap your head around the staggering numerical imbalance here. When Cortés actually made landfall, his vanguard consisted of only a few hundred soldiers. A few hundred! It's a minuscule force gearing up to challenge the mighty, deeply entrenched Aztec Empire.
So how on earth did such a small group succeed? Well, Cortés was cunning. He forged critical alliances with indigenous groups who were already desperate to overthrow Aztec rule. Together, this coalition marched on the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. And this place was an absolute engineering marvel. It literally left the Spanish awestruck. Built directly on Lake Texcoco, it boasted broad streets, huge temples, bustling markets, and a population that actually dwarfed most European capitals at the time. But things escalated incredibly fast. What started in 1519 as a sort of cautious, diplomatic welcome by Emperor Montezuma II rapidly fell apart. Over the next few months, all that simmering tension just exploded into brutal warfare. And making matters infinitely worse was a devastating, unseen weapon, smallpox. By 1521, this magnificent city fell. It signaled the catastrophic collapse of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of Spanish rule over central Mexico.
Let's keep moving. Part 3. Pizarro conquers the Incas, extracting wealth from the Andes. Just a decade later, another Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, points his compass toward a completely different, incredibly formidable geography down in South America. Think about the sprawling scale of Spain's ambitions here. They're shifting operations from the lush valleys of central Mexico all the way down to the Inca Empire, a massive, highly organized domain ruling millions of people across the unforgiving peaks of the Andes Mountains.
Now, Pizarro got extremely lucky with timing. The Inca Empire was uniquely vulnerable right at the exact moment the Spanish showed up. They had just been fractured by this bitter, bloody civil war between two rival brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. Pizarro just ruthlessly capitalized on all that internal division.
In 1532, he moved aggressively, pulling off a surprise ambush to capture Emperor Atahualpa. And even though the Inca paid out this absolutely enormous ransom, we're talking literal rooms filled with gold and silver, the Spanish executed the emperor anyway. It was a brutally efficient campaign that ended with the Spanish seizing the capital city of Cusco. Pretty soon, galleons completely loaded down with unprecedented wealth were sailing back to Europe, basically making Spain the wealthiest power on the continent.
But we have to look at the other side of this. Part 4. The devastating human cost, disease, and forced labor. To really understand this explainer impartially, we have to confront a grim reality. Spain's unimaginable wealth was directly built on the catastrophic, irreplaceable losses of indigenous peoples. This tragedy was really driven by two compounding forces. First, the unchecked spread of European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Because indigenous communities had absolutely zero natural immunity, the biological toll was apocalyptic. And on top of that, survivors were forced into brutal colonial labor systems, made to work the very mines and plantations that were fueling Spain's new empire.
The sheer speed of this demographic collapse is honestly hard to fathom. We are talking about entire villages practically disappearing within a single generation. The pressure this put on ancient indigenous cultures, their religions, and their complex political systems under colonial rule is just staggering.
But, despite all these immense hardships, it's so important to remember this isn't just a story of defeat. Not at all. Indigenous communities fiercely resisted the conquest. Through just incredible resilience, they preserved vital aspects of their languages, their traditions, and their identities, cultural pillars that absolutely survive and thrive today. All right, let's look at the bigger picture. Part 5, a shift in global power and the global fallout.
By the middle of the 16th century, the geopolitical map had been entirely redrawn. The back-to-back conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires fundamentally rewired the entire global economy. By the mid-1500s, Spain was the undisputed dominant European power in the Americas. That staggering influx of New World silver and gold totally transformed trade routes, shifted ancient alliances, and completely altered the course of global politics.
But here's the catch. All that boundless success, it was a major double-edged sword. All that immense wealth flowing across the Atlantic basically painted a massive target on Spain's back. It directly inspired rival European nations, specifically places like England, France, and the Netherlands, to jump in and try to carve out their own American colonies.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to think about this. What happens when the wealth of one empire paints a massive target on its back, inviting competition that will eventually create new nations? Spain's rapid, ruthless momentum didn't just build a single empire, it ignited a fierce global competition. You really have to wonder how different the modern map would look if that wealth hadn't sparked the colonial race that eventually shaped North America. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this truly pivotal epic in history.